Judy.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much indeed, everybody, for joining our final observer session for Scotland's Climate Assembly. We really appreciate you taking time to join us on a Sunday evening. My name is Susie Townend and I head the secretariat responsible for the arrangements of the Assembly. And just to remind those of you that are joining for the first time that we are going to record this session today. So the format is going to be for you to hear from a few of the people who have been involved, and then there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end. Just to remind everyone, Scotland's Climate Assembly is independent of government and Parliament and was set up as a requirement under Scotland's 2019 Climate Change Act. Back in September 2020, we recruited over 100 members selected to be representative of the people of Scotland. People from all over Scotland and with a diversity of lived experience and attitudes to climate change came together in November to answer the question, how should Scotland change to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way? Members met online for 7 weekends and went on a journey of learning, deliberation and decision making. Scotland's Climate Assembly officially submitted its full recommendations for action to the Scottish Parliament on the 23rd of June, and the report includes 81 recommendations agreed on by consensus that are designed to achieve 16 key goals spanning a wide range of policy areas. The Scottish Government's response was published on the 16th of December and addresses all of the 81 recommendations made by Assembly members and the 42 calls to action from Children's Parliament. We have now just concluded our final weekend where members came together for one last time to discuss the Scottish Government response to the recommendations and have agreed a statement. I know that many of you have joined our observer sessions before, so I'm not going to repeat any more details of the arrangements today, but if you do want to know more, there is lots of information on our website. And you can also watch previous observer sessions from weekend 6, which focused on process, and weekend 7, which reflected upon the Assembly's whole learning journey on our website and YouTube channel. But first I wanted to share 3 things that I took away from this weekend. And I'm sure other people will have taken different things away, but this is what I took away from the weekend. The first was a really strong desire for accountability and for a mechanism for the Assembly and others to keep track of the progress that government has committed in their response to making. The second was ambition. The Assembly have developed this really strong vision for how Scotland should change to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way, and both of those are really important, and are determined to ensure that the Scottish Government should demonstrate a similarly positive attitude. And what they said in their statement is they described it in terms of thinking hard about how government can make things happen. So that absolutely strong sense of ambition came through. And then finally, and perhaps surprisingly, given that we've conducted all of these sessions online, what I took away from this weekend in particular, but also the engagement that we've had over this long process, has been that we have developed this really strong sense of community within the Assembly itself, with an incredible desire for members to keep in touch with each other, to meet up, to reconvene next year, to support each other, both in terms of climate action, but in wider aspects of their lives. And that has been incredibly heartwarming. But there's also been a sense of the kind of wider community and a partnership that they, as an Assembly, feel a partnership with government, especially with Children's Parliament and with others, and a strong commitment to a dialogue between themselves as an Assembly and these different parts of Scotland's community and society. And so what I took away was a very strong sense of those 3 things: accountability, a desire for accountability, huge ambition and passion to see that vision achieved, and a strong sense of community. I'm really pleased that part of what they have spoken about so passionately, particularly this weekend, has been the involvement of the children. Our members were aged 16 and over, but we really wanted to make sure that the voices of younger people were heard. And so we've worked very closely with Children's Parliament to integrate that perspective into the Assembly's work. And I'm really pleased that Katie and 3 of the children, Nadia, Tyler and Aisha, are here to tell you a little bit about their experience, and we'll pass first to Katie and then she'll introduce the children as well. Fantastic to see Nadia, Tyler and Aisha as part of this call, although at the moment I can only actually see Nadia. I don't know whether, there's Tyler. Is there a chance to get Aisha on as well? Perfect, fantastic. I'll pass over to Katie.
Great, thanks, Susie. It's really lovely to be here with Nadia, Tyler and Aisha this afternoon. We were with the Adult Assembly members yesterday, and so we're just going to spend a few minutes together just reflecting on the children's contribution to the Climate Assembly over the last 15 months or so. So I guess to get started, Nadia, would you mind just explaining to everyone here what it's been like being part of this journey? What have you been doing as a member of Children's Parliament Investigator Team?
I've been doing a lot. So like since I think last 2020 October, we've been meeting up for calls and we've been meeting climate change experts. And from the knowledge we learned from them, we created our own calls to action for climate change. And so, honestly, we've learned a lot. We've chatted a lot. We've had lots of fun. And since we now have gotten the government response, we're able to see what's going to happen, what we really kind of did.
Brilliant, thanks Nadia. And we've spent quite a lot of time over the last few days talking about the government response, and you met with the adults yesterday to discuss it as well. Either yourself or Tyler, Aisha, would you like to just say a little bit about what you feel the government response has been like? What's your take on it? Tyler, do you maybe want to give that one a go?
Yeah, so I feel like the government's response has been pretty positive, but I feel like there is a couple bits that could be stepped up in other certain parts where we looked at calls to action.
Is there anything in particular, any calls to action that you feel maybe are your favorites, you feel strongly about?
My favorite call to action has to be the National Tree Planting Day.
And we were hearing that the Adult Assembly members were actually talking about that today, weren't we? And that they've been pushing forward the children's call to action about having a National Tree Planting Day. So that's brilliant. And Aisha, for you, what are some of the things that you've enjoyed or learned being a member of the Children's Parliament in this process?
I've enjoyed sharing my thoughts about climate change, having my voice heard, and meeting up with other people to talk about climate change.
Fantastic. And do you think, when we're thinking about the government's response, when you met with the Adult Assembly members yesterday, what was that like? How did you find meeting with some of the adults?
It was great. I got to hear like from their perspective of things, and they also got to hear like my opinions on it as well.
Fantastic. And so there's lots of people on this call that are interested in hearing about from the Climate Assembly, but also from the children's work. And what would your top tips or your advice be to other people that might be interested in looking at involving children and younger people in climate assemblies or other forms of citizens' assemblies in the future? What would your advice to them be?
Make it enjoyable for children. But of course, like have information about climate change, but make it like in a fun way so that they enjoy it, learning about it.
Aisha. Nadia, what about you? What would your top tips be?
To listen to what the children have to say, and not that they're just children, because I think we really do care about our future and what's going to happen. So just listen and include, because honestly, some of the ideas I've heard from the other children are really good.
do you want to share some of the ideas?
Oh, when one of our investigators, Ben, got an idea where we would like bring all landowners into a call, try to convince them into trying to be more climate change friendly, because that was a really good one, because we found out that lots of carbon emission and that is from landowners and they could do a difference. So that's why he wanted to bring them all together and talk about it.
Yeah, we're working on that one, aren't we? Thanks, Nadia. And Tyler, for you, what do you think your top tip would be to
My
the...
top tip would probably just like, as Nadia and Aisha said, listen and make it enjoyable. So maybe even sending fun ways to learn information, maybe like board games or other games, maybe like a Jenga one where each piece has like a fact about climate change, and then you just play Jenga with them. So
sounds great. Definitely lots of good ideas from you all. Well, thank you so much. And as we've seen over the weekend, like the contribution that you've all brought to the process as the children, there was 113 in total, and you three were part of the investigator team that kind of led the investigation. You know, the contribution has just been so felt, and seeing you there yesterday talking about your calls to action with the adults was just so powerful and so special. So thank you from me and the Children's Parliament team, but also from everyone here for all that you've done over the last 15 months. I hope you're feeling really proud, because we're so proud of you. Thanks, Susie.
Thank you very much indeed to Katie, Nadia, Tyler and Aisha. And it certainly has been something which has been very distinctive and we think probably unique. And you have just been the most amazing contributors. Thank you very much. We're, I think, going to try to show you what the Assembly members said in their statement. Now, this only happened about an hour ago, so we're really pushing our technology to the limits, and I'm looking to see whether somebody in my team is looking relaxed about this, or whether they're wanting us to wait just a little bit longer. But please, there's going to be a little bit more of just making sure that there are commas and there's no duplication of words and things. So you'll see this is exactly how the members reported back to each other. We're sharing it with you because we thought it was important for the observers to see what happened today. But please just recognise that it isn't completely polished yet, and we will be putting it out in a more kind of polished framework over the next couple of days. So we'd be grateful if you didn't share all of the words, just in case some of them get tweaked in the process of editing. But do please enjoy seeing the Assembly members saying what they wanted to say back to government as their response to the government response. Scott, are you able to share? Thank you very much indeed to Scott for showing the video and to the Assembly members. And we are tremendously grateful to Scotland's Climate Assembly members for those incredibly powerful statements, indeed for all the work that they've done over such a prolonged period. And I'm delighted that we have two of them with us to speak to you now. I wonder if we can highlight Joan. Excellent. Hello, Joan. So my first question to you, and we saw you feeding back as part of the session, is how did you find this weekend?
I think yesterday was quite scary. It was like information overload. When you've not done a weekend, you kind of get out of the way of it. And it just seemed there was so much coming at us. And I think yesterday I was quite disappointed with the government response and felt a bit, they've not done enough. But I have to say though, the children did help yesterday afternoon. That was fabulous. It refreshes you when you're listening to them. They're an inspiration. But today I didn't feel as bad. I felt okay. There's some things that they're willing to do, but there is an awful long way they've got to go. But I'm not totally depressed about it, but still wish they'd done a wee bit more.
Excellent, thank you. And what are your hopes going forward for what comes out of the Assembly?
Well, I agree with we should have the yearly check. I think that would be absolutely fabulous, just to keep government, we're still watching. We're still waiting to see. And then also Patrick Harvey today, he had said we need to change public expectations and attitudes. Well, I think he should be using the Climate Assembly and the Children's Parliament as a resource for education, because we're all from different socio-economic backgrounds and we've got a wealth of knowledge now that we never had. And if they want, educate the country as a whole, we'd quite happy go out and sell it in the street corner. But I just feel we're a resource users.
Thank you so much, Sean. Really appreciate that, and appreciate you taking the time at the end of a very long weekend to feed back and to bring that energy to this meeting. I'm hoping that we have Ellie on the call as well. Do we have Ellie? Yeah. Hi, Ellie.
There. Hi.
Hi, Ellie. Now, Ellie, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, I know that over the months, particularly from the time we finished meeting in March and then the report came out in June to reconvening now, you have been incredibly busy and active. And I just wanted to ask you if you would be happy to share some of the things that you've been doing and how perhaps being part of the Assembly made you more confident about taking some climate action.
Yeah, thank you. Well, kind of echoing what Joan was saying about just feeling that we were given such a wealth of knowledge, up-to-date evidence from the expert panel and the evidence leads, and it really was very insightful, raised our awareness of how serious the urgency and climate emergency is. And once you're given that information, you really feel like you have to share it, like Joan was saying, and take it further. So after the last weekend 7, I just kind of volunteered to sign up for all the things that were on offer, to speak to MSPs, Nicola Sturgeon, lots of different training opportunities. And then COP26 came about, and I took some time off with my family. We actually drove our camper van to COP26, and we just parked outside the green zone and got fully immersed for 4 days. And it was actually, I was pretty disconcerted with the green zone. There was a lot of greenwashing. It was pretty disappointing. I felt really disillusioned with the world leaders and all of the things that were going on that level. But there was just an amazing wealth of creativity that was going on with the coalition fringe events that we found ourselves in, in Govan at Val Gale Centre that declared itself a free state, and listened to a lot of Indigenous peoples and environmental activists from all around the world, and just felt really inspired. We joined the March for Climate Justice, and from that, I wrote a blog, and this kind of journey of losing my faith and trust in the kind of governance that's high up, and my energy and the rage that I was experiencing, and channel it into kind of more action at a local level. And so one of the things I was persuaded to do by a local who's already a candidate, local Green Party in the Scottish Borders, I've put my name as a candidate for our local wards. So I'm just starting that journey now, and I just noticed that there's someone here from SCCAN. I've signed up for the Conversation for Change facilitator, and so I've got some training due for that next month. So just like Joan was saying, wanting to share the wealth of knowledge, and something that I picked up is that the responses that we've got from government, I feel if they were equipped that we were given as assembly members, I think they would be taking us a lot more seriously. And one of the doubts they seem to be common is public perception or public readiness for this. But if we're the representatives as a mini Scotland, I can guarantee them that if the whole of Scotland were given the information we have, they would be really ready to take on board the urgency of these recommendations that we've put in the document.
Thank you so much, Ellie. That's fantastic to hear. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing all of those exciting things that you've been part of and your plans for the future as well. Thank you. I'm going to now pass to some of our evidence leads. So Professor Ian Stewart has been the members' lead academic guide and has really gone with them along the whole process of supporting them. And we also have Catherine Trebek from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and John Ward from the London School of Economics. And over the entire assembly, members heard from more than 100 speakers who presented a variety of different perspectives and gave members an evidential base that Joan and Ellie were talking about on which to base their decisions. And this continued again with weekend 8 when experts provided support to the members to navigate this huge response that they got back from government. And so I wonder whether I could start off with Ian, just to ask you to reflect a little bit on your involvement with the evidence group.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. It's I mean, I've reported back on some of the things in the past about how the mechanics of the evidence group work, but just as a very brief overview, the stewarding group gave us the question of and guidance on the actual membership in terms of the evidence group, and then once that was established, we started to put together the program of with the involved team about how we were going to marshal that evidence, how we were going to set it out over a course of the multiple weekends, and how we were going to establish and embed some of the really fundamental questions around effectiveness and fairness. So that was some of the things we spent a lot of time in the first couple of weeks setting the context of. I think I explained climate change, climate science in an 8-minute video, this was one of the things we had to learn as experts, is how do we take these complicated, sprawling discourses that we're so used to and condense it, wrap it down into these really bite-sized pieces. And I think all of us struggled with that. It's a really difficult thing. So the first couple of weeks of context setting, trying to balance up some of these fundamental, deep structural aspects about what underlying the issues of climate change alongside policy and legislation, etc., and the science bit. And the science bit turns out to be the easiest bit. And then moving into the tartan stage about the Scottish context, what's actually been done and all of this, and that was done over 3 weeks, and focusing down on certain themes. So themes about work and transport, themes about land and food, and themes about homes and communities, and moving people around in those 3 areas. What I would say is one of the really interesting areas has been trying to have that increasing space for the members to have their discussions. So in the first couple of weeks, it was probably more us, and they were, feeling the vast majority of them had said they hadn't really thought at all about climate change. So many of them were taking them from scratch. But actually, as the weekends went on, more and more space was allocated across to the members themselves. And I think one observation I had on this weekend is actually how little they needed the experts. The experts were on hand for the evidence group, and we really weren't called upon. And I think that's because they now have the confidence themselves to be sharing their own knowledge, but also confidence in their own individual abilities to look at this stuff. And I'm sure you kind of heard that coming through, that those final remarks, that actually they were thinking very deeply and quite profoundly about some of these issues. And I think that's because of some of the issues that we then surfaced right at the start were coming through around about equity, around about fundamental fairness, about urgency, about the pace and scale of change. And so it's been a really interesting process. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, Oliver put something in the chat about the Children's Parliament. I think they've been really important. And I think there's kind of 3 phases to their contribution. At first, it was just entertaining the first few weeks, hearing the children, and there was that burst of energy and things like that. It broke it up. But I think in the middle part, there was this sudden transformation where members were going in to talk to the children and coming back into the adult one and saying, the children's ones are much more direct, much simpler. We really need to go there. And I think there was a transformative thing yesterday when we heard back from the children, which changed it again, the dynamic, which was suddenly people seeing that intergenerational equity in the faces of those children. And I think seeing the children with much more bolder, simpler asks, I think emboldened the recommendations coming through from the adult one. So it was a really interesting dynamic to watch. I know John's on the call, and I don't know if John wants to add anything from his perspective. John, are you?
I mean, Ian, you kind of stole a lot of the things I noted down as things I wanted to say. I mean, the thing in particular which struck me over this weekend has been, as you say, how little the members felt that they needed to draw upon the evidence leads, and kind of you can see that in the confidence and the ambition of the statement which came out this afternoon. So, I mean, I think that I would echo that wholeheartedly. I think the only other reflection I would have throughout the whole process was just how much the evidence was taken, what was provided by the evidence lead was taken, but it was always really carefully distilled through the lens of the lived experiences of the members. And that what came out of the process of the recommendations and then what we see today is not just kind of regurgitated versions of what some of the evidence leads had said, or some of the evidence providers had said, but was actually changed, altered, kind of adjusted to take account of what what the members felt was important and how they wanted to take forward the evidence that they've received. So it was very much a kind of a document and a response today, which reflects kind of the genuine kind of lived experiences of the members.
And I know Catherine's there as well. Catherine, I wonder if you want to add your thoughts on it.
Yeah, very, very happy to. And I've been involved to a much lesser degree than John and you have, Ian, but my overriding impression is just how incredibly lucky Scotland is, because 100 people from the most diverse backgrounds put up their hand to get their hands dirty in the detail, the policies and the practice of addressing this very complicated issue of climate change, and deal with all the drivers of that and think through creative solutions at all levels, really quick practical ones that need to be done tomorrow, and then some of the more deeper root causes as well. And I just think how incredibly fortunate Scotland is, and Joan's point there around make the most use of them now. Their wealth of knowledge, they've soaked up and digested and computed all this different evidence, and they're ready to go out there and be beacons for these conversations. I just think such an astute point. And the final point I make is one of my heroes, a guy called John Hall, talks about the serendipitous benefits that come from deliberative processes. And I think Ellie's story around how she's been inspired to go along to COP and sign up for dialogue training and now run as a counsellor and get involved in politics just speaks to those serendipitous benefits as well. So above and beyond the recommendations, and my gosh, it's great to see how rigorous the Assembly is in saying to the Scottish Government, this is not enough. We've spent 7 weekends on Zoom diving into this, and this is not good enough. That's amazing. But just those benefits beyond the reports themselves, I just think are extraordinary. So it's just been such an honour to have a tiny little window into it, and full credit to the secretariat for navigating it as well, just how incredibly complicated the practicalities around that. It just looks amazing from the window I've had into it.
Thank you so much, Ian, Catherine and John. Really appreciate that. And Ian, Catherine and John are available to take questions. If you have particular questions that you want to direct to them, then if you pop them in the chat, then when we get to the questions, I'll put them back to them. But our next speaker is Oliver Escobar, who's a lecturer of public policy at the University of Edinburgh, but more importantly for us, a member of the Assembly Stewarding Group, which was established within the governance structure to provide advice and guidance in all aspects of the Assembly, and to ensure balance and legitimacy in the establishment, conduct and reporting of the Assembly. And I've just asked him to reflect a little bit about that process. Oliver.
Yeah, I mean, I could just carry on listening to the members and the children, but thanks for the opportunity. I think I just want to make a couple of points. One of them is that famous phrase that this is not an event, it's a process. And, you know, the Assembly has done a lot of work, but they are part of a broader network. In the chat we mentioned SCAN, and there are all kinds of interesting and active community networks across the country. And the Assembly really relies on them to keep some of this fire alive. And there was during the sessions this weekend, there was talk about the mandate that the Assembly now gives to all kinds of groups, not just political leadership, but also all kinds of groups and policy networks to take forward the pretty challenging and transformative work that needs to happen to meet the level of ambition of the Assembly. Now, the second point is just to address a perennial debate around assemblies and their role in our political systems. They're meant to provide a bridge. They cannot solve everything, but they can provide a bridge between communities and institutions. This Assembly has done that in spades, I would argue. But we need to be mindful that as Assembly members explore throughout the weekend, policy processes and decision-making, these are not linear processes. And Assembly members recognize that it's going to take bold action and leadership, both political leadership and also civic leadership, to push forward these agendas in the face of some of the most challenging structural blocks to some of the more transformative aspects of their recommendations. So, this might be the end of this space, but hopefully it's the multiplication of other spaces and networks that build on what the Assembly has done and keeps moving this forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Oliver. And now I'm going to ask Kayla Scott just to speak a little bit about the design process. Kayla is involved and was one of the lead facilitators, in fact, was the lead facilitator that accompanied all the way through, and much of the work and the vision for how the Assembly would unfold has been in the head of Kayla, and she deserves huge credit. I know she's incredibly experienced in delivering these sorts of deliberative processes, but I think I'm right in saying that having a weekend aid is an extra bonus that is not always part of the toolkit. So we're particularly grateful that, having asked you to do that extra bit of work, you've come again and have come to talk to the observers. So I'll hand over to you and let you just reflect a little bit on the process.
Yeah, I mean, having the opportunity to bring the Assembly members back together after several months where their report has gone to Parliament and then they've got this response back from government was a really great opportunity, actually, and it's not something I've seen with other assemblies at all anywhere before, really. That said, it was also a real challenge for the members, and Joan definitely reflected there that idea. It was a bit overwhelming to start with. We had the government's response is a big document with a lot of things in there and a lot of sort of comments and suggestions, and some very positive things that were responded to by members and some things that they were really quite disappointed about. And we knew that would be the case. So we were trying to create a process that actually got them to look right across all of the goals they had established, and then dig down throughout the weekend into what actually was most important to them to respond back to government. So taking advice from the sort of the evidence group at the beginning, and then working through members themselves prioritizing what were the topics they wanted to focus on, the sort of sections of that statement that you've just seen. Overnight, we sort of compiled that together, drew out where there was commonalities across some of the different groups, and then each group, you may have heard people saying, our topic was, or the one we allocated. It's because it went back to them, the priorities that each group had identified, to be able to develop up these statements that they then did a bit of reviewing of each other's and making suggestions and comments between the groups. and then confirmed them. And what you saw was the first time we'd seen them all as well. When the members came together at the end of the session and essentially presented their conclusions to each other. And we'll be, as Susie said, building that into a statement. The order might shift some of them a bit, just tidying it up so it reads in a nice little flow, but very much sticking exactly to the words the members wrote and then spoke this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Kayla. And Kayla has also said that she's happy to take questions after this. And the final person that I wanted you to hear from is Ruth Harvey, one of our co-conveners. Josh Littlejohn is the other co-convener, and he joined at the start of the call, but unfortunately has had to drop off. And so I'm going to pass immediately to Ruth, who I think will be able to cover on both their behalves, just the perspective of the conveners.
Thanks, Susie. And yes, I just have a few reflections to share on behalf of Josh and myself, who have been co-conveners, really sitting, watching, listening, and our role is to amplify the voice of the citizens and of the Assembly. So just a few words about the process. You've heard quite a lot about that already. This has been quite a remarkable process. At the end of the Weekend 8, one of the reflections I shared with the group that was meeting was, it's been like a bit like watching or coming out at the end of a very complex 8-sim reel, and somehow knowing that you've got through safely and you're elated and you're energized, maybe a little bit sweaty and exhausted, but you don't quite know how. Somebody's been kind of pushing your back and showing you where to go. And I think it's been a bit like that. We've had the most remarkable professional production team, facilitation team to keep us all together, and to build that sense of holistic community that Susie was talking about earlier, representing a community that represents a massive diversity of views. The process has been remarkable, even though it's been on Zoom. So a couple of words about the outcomes. You've heard what the Assembly members have said. The government has responded to each of the goals in great detail, and it's been quite an impressive set of responses. But you'll also have heard that Assembly members felt that a lot of the responses fell fairly far short of their expectations and their hopes. So, and really crucially, I think, members have included a really powerful clarion call for what they called for ongoing and sustained dialogue, not just between the Assembly and the Scottish government, but also with the Children's Parliament. So there's a really clear call for an annual review with this Citizens' Assembly, and we'll see where that goes. We know we can't make that promise on behalf of government, but government will hear that call. It's a bit like the COP26 process, which requires nations to make a regular commitment to meet together to account for their actions. So 100+ citizens of Scotland have asked for that similar accountability internally within Scotland. One of the Assembly members that spoke in the wee group I was in today said, "I would like to stay engaged in such a way that we can continue to hold the decision makers to account and can monitor progress. I want to hold on to this voice of Scotland to see the process through." And I think that sentiment was reflected in other Assembly members. I guess I want to say a word about the emotional journey that's also been gone on. So in addition to the really positive engagement with government, there's also a fair measure of despair expressed by members of the Assembly throughout the 8 weekends. But poignantly, somebody today said that they felt wounded and even damaged by the process. And now here's a really interesting, it's a wound and a damaging that's an expression of human vulnerability. And we would expect nothing less, I suppose, having been exposed to the enormity of the challenges of the climate emergency. And this has been reflected in the process of the Assembly through the various different mechanisms for support for those of us who do feel deeply wounded and damaged by what we've heard. There is support out there, and we must take that acknowledgement of human vulnerability and turn it into energy for action. So I guess this part of the journey is a real powerful reflection that in raising awareness of the enormity of the impact of the climate emergency, the question remains, how do we offer real in-person support to one another to navigate this storm? So the community that Susie and others have referred to is not just a community of the head, it's a community of the heart. It's a very relational community where people's feelings and vulnerabilities matter. And that has been a crucial part of this process. And this is my final word really about the legacy and the hope. Notwithstanding all that I've said about the despair and the anxiety, there is a huge amount of hope and potential for the future, summed up in the responses by the Citizens' Assembly today, like you heard in these short videos, to the response of the government. The power of the democratic process, however, would be lost utterly if there was no long-term investment, not only in the goals and recommendations, but also in the individuals, in the team, in the community, in the people who gathered and learned and were empowered to bring about change. So the real legacy of this process will be in the way that the Assembly is empowered to continue its bold and courageous work, along with the Children's Parliament and the annual check-in with the Scottish Government. So really it's over to the Scottish Government to respond to that request. Assembly members have consistently spoken with boldness and with urgency. Their goals and recommendations are bold and urgent. Their response to the government's response is itself bold and urgent. And so they now expect bold and urgent action by the Scottish Government to reach net zero by 2030 in a fair and effective way. And I can tell you that the citizens of this Assembly are ready and willing to play their full part in that journey.
Thank you so much, Ruth. So when people registered for this session, we gave you the opportunity to also put down any questions that you would like us to ask, and some of you were kind enough to do that. So I'm going to go to those of you who did that first. And I think we do have Nikki Van Dyke on the call. I think I saw something from you in the chat, but you had a question that you sent us about the impact of the Children's Parliament. Do you want to ask that question? Or would you like me to do it for you?
No, sure. Just setting up all the sound. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited. So I'm all the way from Australia, so quickly peeking in. Yeah, I'm very interested. I do research about intergenerational justice and the influence of climate assemblies. I'm particularly interested in how the Children's Assembly had an impact, and particularly looking forward if another assembly would be organized. Would you do it differently, or, for example, include younger children with the adults, or yeah, I would love to hear a bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask Oliver, Kayla and Katie to answer those questions very, very briefly, because we do have some more questions to get through, but maybe to start off with Katie.
Thanks so much for the question, and it's definitely something that at the end of this process we are reflecting a lot on, and yeah, producing a kind of impact report as we speak. So we're keen to share that with you, Nikki, in due course. But I think Ian alluded to this earlier. I know Joan has spoken about this, one of our Climate Assembly members. The impact of the children's contribution has been multifaceted, and I think the way that Ian summarized it earlier, the intergenerational element has been such a strength of this whole process. And I think bringing 7-year-olds and 70-year-olds together at different touch points throughout the process has really enriched the dialogue. It has, as Ian alluded to, even strengthened some of the recommendations and the outcomes. In terms from a process point of view, I'll admit there wasn't much of a blueprint for this, so we had to kind of draw from a patchwork of different projects, consultations, other work that we've done with children before. I will say we've had a blast getting to design something like this with the children at each step of the way. But I do think, and right at the beginning, I remember conversations with Susie and Eleanor in the secretariat. We didn't know how to necessarily go about this, and I think if we could do it all again, perhaps having more opportunity for the children and adults to come together would have been brilliant. But just seeing them all together yesterday was really powerful, and a lovely way to bring this to its closure for the time being. I appreciate the calls for potential annual review and future work together. So that's it from my side.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, just super quickly in 20 seconds, just to say, I think this assembly has contributed to the international best practice on a number of grounds. One of them is the inclusion of the Children's Parliament. The other is this 8th weekend and the follow-up, and that should become a standard practice in assemblies, I think. But one point that I think is really important is that the children earned their impact. Initially, it was designed as something that will help assembly members, and through their contribution they earned a place in the final report with the recommendations, and they earned the full attention by assembly members to the point where they became just assembly members themselves, just in a different space. And yet again this weekend they came over, and I feel they completely changed the mood. Yesterday, when things were going in a spiral that might have been more unproductive, and really helped to focus and bring up the spirits to produce the robust statement of response back to government.
Thank you, Oliver. And then Kayla.
Yeah, look, I'm going to agree with pretty much everything Katie and Oliver have both said there. I'm sure there is ways, if we were starting this again, we would do things differently. But we found a way to sort of make it work. We weren't really sure how well it would work and how the adults would respond to it and how the children would respond to it. But I think one of the really important things was actually the children were also hearing from a lot of the same evidence leads and same speakers and looking at the same questions, although in slightly different ways than that the adult assembly members were, so that when they were sort of feeding back in and coming back in, there was a real intersection and they were focusing on the same things. And I think, Oliver's absolutely right. The children absolutely earned their impact, because when they were prioritising the questions to put to ministers this morning, one of the things that a couple of the groups prioritised that they really wanted to take to Patrick Harvey was the fact of, well, why can't we have a national children's plan, like National Tree Planting Day, as the children suggested there? And, given they had limited numbers of questions and time, it was really important to them that actually they really wanted to stand up for the children in that respect as well. So quite integrated, but hopefully we can do more.
Thank you very much indeed. And Doreen, you just wanted to say a little bit about next steps as far as involving children.
Really, just very quickly to build on what's said, we have learned already from the fantastic job that the Children's Parliament did this time round. But a number of us on this call are involved in some work to look at how we institutionalise citizen assemblies and make sure that we have the processes so that we do them well. And one part of that work is looking at how we make sure that children and young people are routinely involved. They shouldn't be seen as an add-on or an exception. It's how we make that properly routine.
Great. Thank you very much, Doreen. I'm not sure if Lucas Hirsch is on the call. Is he on the call? I'm looking for somebody in the team too.
Yes.
He is on the call. Lucas, you asked a question about interest organisations. Would you like me to ask it, or would you like to go ahead and ask it yourself? I think you're on mute.
Seems to have come off mute, but we can't actually hear you.
Try again. No. Try one more time, otherwise I can ask the question for you. Try now. No, I'm sorry, it's not working. Well, since you were kind enough to send the question, if you don't mind, I will ask it for you. Is that okay? I can see you nodding. So your question was about the perceptions of interest organisations and were they aware of the Citizen Assembly regarding the outcome and the government response, and do they support the recommendations, and then do they support the government response, and are they content about the role they played in the Climate Assembly so far? So quite a lot of things in that. So if I can unpack that a little, what we did in the period between June and the government response coming out was we set up what we called a Civic Charter, and we got a wide cross-section of organisations to sign up to that. And that was an opportunity for Scotland's society, whether in business or civil society organisations or interest groups, to say that they were standing with Scotland's Climate Assembly. And so I guess that's an indication that there was societal support for the Assembly recommendations. Then in terms of the government response, what we really encouraged people to do was to give the Assembly members the primacy that they deserved, and to let them come back and reflect on the government response first. And then once they had had a chance to do that, then there would be an opportunity for others to say what they thought. And so that's really kind of the point we've got to, that we've now been through weekend 8, we know what the members, who are the most important people in this process, think, and now there will be opportunity for others. So I hope that's sufficient answer for that question. I'm going to move on to a question now from Sandy Carmichael, and again I'm just hoping that somebody can tell me whether Sandy is there. There's a general shaking of heads, but because we got the question in advance, we do have somebody primed to answer this, and so I'll read it out for you. And it's, in what ways is the Climate Assembly equipped to monitor implementation of the Scottish Government's plans in response to the Climate Assembly report? If not done by the Climate Assembly, then by whom? And as you'll have heard, there is a lot of discussion about exactly that point, and some recommendations from the Assembly, and also, as you heard just now from Ruth as convener, about a mechanism for allowing the Assembly to continue to monitor implementation. But Doreen is going to say a little bit more as well about that.
Thanks, Susie. And I have to say, this Assembly has taught us so much in Scotland already, and really the power of the responses today around ensuring that the Assembly members go on having an impact is really important. But as I mentioned before, we are looking at how we institutionalise the use of citizen assemblies overall. And some of the really important elements that we're looking at is what governance it has, you know, how we make sure they're independent, how we make sure they're transparent. But scrutiny is really important. So there's no point in people spending 6 weekends talking without being able to be reassured that something will happen with work that they've done. So while I can't give you a clear answer on whether we can definitely have an annual review, it seems absolutely obvious to me that that should happen. And I will work very hard to try and help achieve that. But I should say that there are several other places where scrutiny will happen. So there are 2 parliamentary committees, one on net zero and one on citizen assemblies and petitions. So Parliament itself will scrutinise the recommendations and will expect to see regular updates. So there will be ways, but I think this Assembly has really taught us so much about the things we need to put in place and to support the members who want to go on, because not all will, but to really feel that they can continue to contribute to the issues.
Thank you very much indeed, Doreen. And then the final question that we had in advance was from Graham Smith about how members managed to review the government response. And Graham, do you want to go ahead and ask that question if you can still remember it?
Yeah. Also, it might have been bypassed a bit from everything that's been said, but I'm really fascinated about how you actually, excuse me, managed to coordinate citizens across one weekend to reflect on 81 recommendations. And I saw the material that was produced by some of the expert leads, and I was just wondering how much that was used to structure. So it's kind of a process question, which everyone would expect me to ask, which is about how you actually managed to deal with all of that material.
Thank you very much indeed, Graham. And so I'm going to ask Kayla to talk primarily about the process, and then just leave a moment for Ian to reflect a little bit on that question about content.
Yeah, I mean, the evidence group, it was great, did that sort of early assessment of just to give people a bit of a traffic lighting to help people through it. It's a massive document. And as has been noticed, we have a really diverse group of people in the Assembly. So, you know, some arrived this weekend having read it with fine-tooth comb, with like, you know, post-it notes and things that were already identified as important to them. And some had it sort of sitting next to their couch for a week and, you know, really had barely flicked through it. And that's totally to be expected. They were engaging with it on the weekend. So we spent the Friday evening really just sort of reminding them of where they were in terms of their ambition at the end of, the assembly. And Ian also did a bit of an update there about just what the context had changed. We focused in the morning, we didn't work through 81 recommendations. We focused on sort of the big goals, and therefore, let's start digging into what's important here in the goals, and that's what they did in their discussion. And then with the children again, starting to think, well, what's important to us? What do we want to say back? And then, really prioritizing down what was important to them. So some of the goals and recommendations weren't discussed a lot over the weekend, because actually it was like, it's all right, it's all right, or it's what we expected. And members really drove what they wanted to focus on. So when we map it across, it doesn't address even necessarily all of the 16 goals explicitly in their statement of response, but it was led by the members themselves.
Thank you very much, Kayla. And Ian, I don't know if you want to say anything about that in terms of the content, in terms of the kind of climate change rather than process.
Yeah, well, we were certainly very aware of not wanting to kind of railroad them into certain directions. And so we made it clear that these were subjective ratings, that actually there was a lot of difference of opinion within the evidence group, and that they may well completely disagree with some of those values. But actually, I think it was kind of academic in the sense of what the members did was they focused on the bits where the government had said no, or basically in one level, or there's some, and so they wired into that. They could have gone the other way and sent around clapping themselves on the back about all the things they said yes on. So I think that really, the government's response focused on those key areas that, as you'll see from the recommendation, with that word disappointment came up multiple times. So, So I don't think they listened very much to us in a good way. In those discussions, they had full confidence in their own ability to work through it. They didn't need us.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I can see that there's one hand up. Ewan, I'm not quite sure. Do you want to ask a question?
Oh, hello.
Hello, Ewan. Do you want to ask your question?
Well, I think my question has been answered very well. I came in fact, I have to admit, I only came in for this last session, but my question was basically about the future, to what extent the Climate Assembly members would be following up with the government all their recommendation and the government's response. And I think I've got the answer to that. But what I really wanted to say was that I get very frustrated actually by when I listen to a lot of the government ministers and talking about climate change, and that vast amounts of money has been spent preparing net zero strategies and this sort of thing. But it's quite clear that there's a lot of greenwash in this. And my final point is really that I've been terribly impressed by what I've heard this evening. This really gives me a lot of encouragement, that there are many people out there who will hold the government to account on many of these issues. And I do hope that at some future date, not too far away, that members of the Assembly can actually be put on, around the table in public for a discussion about these issues, and to what extent, the government is or is not actually meeting the objectives set out in its Climate Act. So I'd like to just finish by saying congratulations, and I hope that I, for one, I think I'll be around for a little while longer, but I do hope I'll hear from you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ewan. And yeah, the Assembly members have just done the most amazing job. We're incredibly proud of what they've achieved. We only have 2 more minutes left, but I can see that there's one more person with a hand up, and that's Carolina.
Hi there. Yes. Yeah, again, thank you so much for everything that you've done. Again, you really deserve a round of applause for all the hard work you've done. I'm currently doing research on international policy making, specifically within climate assemblies. And I was wondering, within kind of this new incoming idea of hybrid democracy with individual involvement in public policy, I was wondering what everyone's experiences are in terms of has being a part of this strengthened or weakened your trust in government, and has it also made you feel more involved in government and policy making?
Thank you very much indeed for that question, Carolina. I'm not going to put our members on the spot, but I think they did say quite powerfully how it had impacted on their response to being involved in policy making. So I'll pass perhaps across to Oliver to reflect on that question, and then perhaps to Caleb to finish, but Oliver to start off with.
Well, the thing is, Carolina, as you probably know, it's still early days actually for this kind of new way of thinking or rethinking democracy, right? Because the reality is that although we've now seen lots of assemblies popping up, especially across Europe, our political systems are now being fully redesigned to really accommodate participatory, deliberative, and representative logics together. So the trailblazers like this process and many others across Europe are having to discover the tensions, the frictions, as well as the synergies. And we shouldn't naively think that just opening up a few new political spaces for this new type of engagement and this new type of bridge between communities and institutions, that's gonna do it. I mean, everything else is still needed. You know, there was a lot of talk in the chat about collective action. There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of economic reform. As we all know, these things are all connected, but a key part of that is rethinking and reimagining democracy so that it can cope with what's coming and what's already happening. I do think that internationally we still have a great deal to learn, and I think there needs to be a lot of rethinking as well how we connect across countries and make these processes just to try and share the learning in a way that avoids replicating some of the mistakes that unavoidably happen when you're trailblazing, as I said. But I'll just my final reflection would be to say that you know, there's a clear sense, and members of this assembly made it very, very clear. They understand this is an ongoing process. We're not just trying to tackle a climate emergency. We are also trying to reimagine the way we work together collectively in order to do so. And in doing so, we're trying to undo, unmake, you know, in some cases decades, in some cases centuries of you know. It's ongoing progress. I think this assembly and many others are contributing to that, but it's up to all of us across our networks and our communities to keep doing the work.
Thank you very much indeed, Oliver. And I'll just give Kayla one moment to reflect perhaps on the kind of wider impact of assemblies on the question.
That wasn't really what I was going to say, but
say whatever you want to say, Kayla.
I will. No, I think what has been, you know, so exciting about this one is the idea that this doing politics differently was a big part of the sort of how the assembly was framed. And I think from the members, and definitely what's come through this weekend, that sense that actually it's not about sitting back and waiting for government to make the decisions. There is a real expectation from the members that a changing way of doing politics is about having that ongoing sort of dialogue between communities, between citizens, and between sort of politicians. And they made that very clear when they were talking to the ministers earlier this earlier this morning. It feels like a very long time ago, about what they expected going forward. And yeah, there's a sort of move towards that expectation of change, which hopefully can deliver a different way of doing things.
Thank you very much indeed, Kayla. And we have gone over time, and I am going to let everybody go. Some people have had incredibly long weekends. I'm very grateful to everybody who has joined this call, whether an assembly member or a facilitator or part of the team that's brought it all together, or as a member of the public who has really been a very important part of that openness and scrutiny, that we were very determined that even though we've been working on Zoom, that there should be transparency, and that people in Scotland and across the world could see what we were doing and hold us to account. And you are part of our community, that community that we've been talking about. You are also part of that. And I hope that you will join with us in supporting the Assembly members and their recommendations, and continuing to watch how they unfold over the future years. Thank you very much indeed.